My journey into the study of haterology began with Twilight. Now, notice I said with Twilight, not at Twilight. Twilight, of course, being the immensely popular movie series that came out in the early 2000s. At the time these movies were in theaters, I was working with an educational institution that was focused on making sure that teenagers had good character and had healthy relationships. And if you worked with teenagers, at the time the Twilight movies were out, you know that all the teenagers wanted to talk about was Twilight. And since I'd never read any of the books or seen any of the movies, I wanted to figure out what was so fascinating about this story. And so one day I saw a group of young ladies sitting at a table, and they were enthralled in this passionate discussion of Team Edward and Team Jacob. And so I approached them and I said, "Tell me what's so great about Twilight." One of the young ladies turned to me and she said, "Dr. West, it's an amazing love story. There's this man named Edward, and he's a vampire. And this girl named Bella that he's in love with. And he wants to bite Bella more than he's wanted to bite anyone else ever before. But he won't do it because he loves her." And as excited as she was to tell me that story, I became terrified. Because my job was to make sure that they had a healthy view of relationships, and that to me was not a healthy view of relationships. And so I turned to the young lady, and in a humorous manner I said, "You recognize that you just attributed love and brownie points to a man for not hurting the woman he loves, right? You don't get brownie points for not hurting the woman you love. That should be basic, ground zero, a foundation. You can't be like, I know he loves me, he want to hurt me, but he don't." Like, that's not... That's not love. You have to demand more from your relationships. Now, I said this hoping that what would happen is the young ladies would turn and they would say, "You know what, Dr. West, we do demand more for our relationships," or "We recognize this is just a fantasy story," or "God forbid, that makes sense." But instead, what happened was far worse than any of those things. Another of the young ladies turned to me and she said, "Dr. West, you a hater." And that was it. That was the end of the discussion. We didn't talk about it again. It was like what I said never mattered. They went on and debated Team Edward and Team Jacob, but what it did was it sent me on a spiral that launched the field of haterology. I wanted to know what just happened here. What happens when we call people a hater? Why do we call them a hater? How does that impact us? How does that impact them? And so I wanted to know all the answers to these questions, and thus haterology was launched. And so as I began to look into this field, one of the things that became apparent to me from the very beginning was that there were two definitions of a hater that had emerged in our culture. The first is the definition that most people would tell you a hater is if you ask them to define hater. They said someone who doesn't want to see you win, someone who wants to impede your progress, someone trying to sabotage your success. And this is how most people would define a hater. However, I found that there was another definition. And this one, I would argue, is the true definition. It's found in the way that people actually use the term hater. You see, most of the time when people use the term hater, what they're using it as is a synonym for dissent or disagreement. I once saw this conversation right here. "Bro, them new Jordans is dope, ain't they?" "I don't really like Jordans." "You a hater, man. You always hating." Now, if you look, there's no sabotage here. There's no desire to hold someone back, just the expressing of a dissenting view. You see, and that's what happened in our society, is that we have conflated dissent and disagreement with the idea of hating. And thus all dissent and disagreement is labeled hating, and all dissenters are labeled haters. I call this the hater mindset. And so what I began to do is I wanted to know what kind of impact this mindset would have on us as individuals and as a culture. And so I wanted to talk to someone and study someone who thought deeply about dissent and disagreement and who really thought about this idea of haters. So I turned to the contemporary sage, Gucci Mane. On his album, America's Most Wanted, Gucci Mane has a song called Haterology. And as you can probably guess, it's about haters. But what caught my attention about this song is that in the first 2 lines of his verse, Gucci Mane outlines the way that he responds to people that he views as haters, people who offer a dissenting view or disagreement from him. And I think the way that he responds to them is indicative of the way people who have adopted the hater mindset respond to dissent and disagreement. Gucci Mane starts his verse by saying, "I'm not listening. I'm not interested." And it is at this point that I think we can learn a lot about the way that the hater mindset impacts us as individuals and as a culture. I would argue that there are 2 significant problems with not listening and not being interested in dissent and disagreement. The first is that it inhibits our ability to critically think. Critical thinking scholars who have examined this topic have really broken the process down into 3 steps. The first step is to understand what you really believe about a topic. What are your underlying assumptions? What are your perceptions, your ideas, your beliefs? You take that and you distill that down and figure out what it is you actually know about the topic. Then they argue that the second step is to take that information and to compare it to dissenting views and opinions. But wait, how do you compare your thoughts, beliefs, perceptions, and ideas to dissenting views, thoughts, perceptions, ideas if you won't listen to dissent or disagreement? You can't actually move into the second step of critical thinking, let alone get to the third step, if you won't even listen to dissenting ideas. And thus you inhibit your ability to critically think. The second problem that I see has to do with this idea of interest. Gucci Mane says, when it comes to haters, even if I do listen, I'm not interested. Now, interest is fascinating because interest in dissent and disagreement can actually lead to increased learning. I'll give you a perfect example. I one day found myself involved in a passionate debate with my family. There was yelling and sides were formed. It was intense. And we weren't debating something that's easily solved like gun control or abortion rights. No, we were debating about what really matters. Who's the best basketball player of all time, right? And so sides have been formed, and my side was advocating for Michael Jordan to be the best basketball player of all time. The other side was advocating for LeBron James. And so in the midst of the conversation, I say, Michael Jordan's the best basketball player of all time. He never lost in the finals. To which the other side responded, Michael Jordan never lost in the finals, but he didn't go 7 times in a row. Now that made me pause, because that would be a strong argument. If someone goes to the NBA Finals 7 years in a row, that would be a strong argument for them to be one of the best, if not the best basketball player of all time. And so I turned to one of the people on my side. I said, hey, did you hear what he just said? And he said, nah, he hating anyway. Don't listen to him. But it was too late for me. I was interested. And so I went to my smartphone and I looked and I Googled, did LeBron James go to the finals 7 years in a row? And I found out that he had gone to the finals 7 years in a row. He was a finals MVP, that he was setting records in all these different categories in such a way that no one had done since like the late 80s and Magic Johnson. And so I learned all this amazing stuff about LeBron James. And so I came back upstairs and I began to share this information with my side, specifically with the guy who told me the other side was hating. And I said, did you know all of this about LeBron James? He said, no, I didn't. And that illustrated a key point for me. You see, he and I both heard the same dissenting view. I became interested and he didn't. And as a result, I learned a whole bunch of information that he didn't learn. You see, interest and learning are linked together. Our interest creates these things known as information gaps in cognitive psychology. An information gap is the gap in your mind between what you know and what you know that you could or should know. It's the feeling you get when you're looking at someone and you recognize their face, but you forgot their name. He's like, don't tell me. It's Jim. Ah, Jim, I knew that. That's an information gap. And you see, interest in dissent and disagreement cause us to have information gaps in areas that we don't normally pursue. And so they can cause us to have learning in areas that we don't normally pursue. But if we say, you know what, dissent and disagreement is something that even if I listen to, I'm not interested in, what we do is we diminish our capacity and potential for learning. And although inhibiting our critical thinking and diminishing our capacity and potential for learning are problems in itself, the real problem is that not listening and not being interested in dissent not only leads to the hater mindset, but there is actually a significant benefit that comes from pursuing dissent and disagreement. And that is the concept known as Janusian thinking. Janusian thinking is based on the Roman god Janus, who had one mind with two faces facing in opposite direction. The concept is that if we can hold in our mind two contradicting ideas at the same time, what we do is we produce novel and innovative results. Some of the greatest innovations of our time can be tracked back to Janusian thinking. One of my favorites is the Wright brothers. The Wright brothers held in their mind the idea that humans cannot fly, but that the physics that allow birds to be able to fly seem like they should apply to humans. And they held those two contradicting ideas in their brain at the same time, and what did they bring about? The airplane. Bill Gates is another example. He held in his mind that computers are powerful. There's something that everyone in every household all across the world should be able to use. But at the same time, the coding language used for computers is not something a lot of people know how to do. So he held those two things, those contradicting ideas in his brain at the same time, and he developed Microsoft Windows. And you can do this for almost any great innovation of our time. Uber, Netflix, almost all these things can be tracked back to Janusian thinking, but Janusian thinking comes not from not listening and not being interested in dissent, but from pursuing it. And so my lesson for us from Haterology today is this. Instead of us not listening and not being interested in dissent, instead of us falling prey to the hater mindset, let's pursue dissent. Let's pursue disagreement. Let's pursue hating. Let's pursue haters, and let that lead us into our era of Janusian thinking. Thank you.